Just before 6 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of August, 1931, the earthen wall holding back the waters of Gyeongju Lake collapsed in total darkness, and somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people drowned in their sleep before they ever understood that the water was coming. They did not wake to a storm. They woke, if they woke at all, to a wall of black water already in the room, already lifting the bed and the children and the rafters all at once. By the time the sun came up over what had been farmland and villages and a town full of living people, the lake had simply expanded over the top of them, flat and brown and silent, and the only sound left was the water still pouring through the broken dike, with a roar that survivors compared to a freight train that would not stop. 10,000 human beings, maybe 15,000, gone in the time it takes to read this sentence a few times over. And here is the part that should make the back of your neck go cold. That night was not the disaster. That breach, on that one lake, on that one night, was a single moment inside a catastrophe that had already been killing people for 2 solid months, and that would go on killing for more than a year after the water at Gyeongju finally went still. When historians try to count the dead from the floods that drowned central China in the summer of 1931, the lowest credible number they can defend is around 400,000. The highest is close to 4 million. Sit with that gap for a second, because the gap itself tells you something terrifying about what happened here. We are not arguing over whether thousands died or tens of thousands died. We are arguing over whether the number of dead was closer to 500,000 or closer to the entire current population of Los Angeles. And the reason we cannot narrow it down is that the machinery a country uses to count its own dead had itself been swept away. This is the deadliest flood in recorded human history, and very possibly the deadliest natural disaster of any kind in the 20th century, outside of pandemic and famine. It killed more people than the eruption that buried Pompeii, more than the San Francisco earthquake, more than the Galveston hurricane and the Johnstown flood and the Great Chicago fire combined. And it did most of its killing in a matter of weeks, and almost nobody outside of China has ever heard of it. There are no Hollywood films about it. Most people who consider themselves reasonably well-read on history have never once encountered the phrase, the 1931 Yangtze flood. That alone should bother you, because the forces that made it so lethal have not gone away, and the lower reaches of those same rivers are home today to roughly half of China's population and the majority of its industry. The water that did this is still there. The question of whether it can do it again is not closed. To understand how it happened, you have to start years before a single dike broke, and you have to start somewhere that feels like the opposite of a flood. You have to start with drought. From 1928 through 1930, much of China baked under a long, punishing dry spell. Rivers ran low, the soil cracked and hardened, and lost the spongy capacity to absorb water that wet, living earth has. Farmers prayed for rain the way only people facing famine can pray for rain. And then, in the winter of 1930 going into 1931, the weather did not simply correct itself. It overcorrected with a violence that nobody alive had seen. That winter was brutally cold in the mountainous upper catchments where China's great rivers are born, and enormous quantities of snow and ice piled up at high elevation. Think of those frozen reserves as a loaded gun. Through the spring, the snow began to melt, and all of that meltwater came pouring down into the channels of the Yangtze and the Hulai and their countless tributaries, raising the water table across central China and saturating that drought-hardened ground until it could hold no more. The rivers were already running high and angry before the truly dangerous part even began, and then the truly dangerous part began. In a normal year, The Yangtze Basin might expect 2 cyclonic storms over the course of an entire season. In July of 1931 alone, it was hit by seven major storms in a single month, stacking rain on top of meltwater on top of already flooded fields. Some weather stations along the river recorded around 2 feet of rainfall in that one stretch. The total volume of water that fell on the Yangtze Valley in that single month was roughly 1.5 times the average annual precipitation for the entire region. A year and a half of rain, in 30 days, onto ground that could not drink it, and into channels that were already brimming. Even a perfectly maintained system of dikes and floodways might have buckled under that. And the system protecting central China in 1931 was very, very far from perfectly maintained. Now we get to the part of this story that turns it from a tragedy into something closer to a crime, because the rain was the trigger, but the rain was not the whole reason millions of people died. For centuries, the people of the Yangtze and Huai basins had been fighting their rivers with earthen dikes, walling the water into ever narrower channels to claim the fertile floodplain for farming. The Great Jinjiang Levee, one of the most important of these barriers, had been completed back in 1548. Generation after generation, more walls went up. More lakes that had once acted as natural overflow basins were either cut off from the rivers by embankments or drained and converted into cropland to feed a growing population. By the late 19th century, the lower Yangtze could effectively drain through only a handful of openings on the south side of the river. And the river, robbed of the room it needed, did what rivers always do. It dropped its sediment on the bottom of its own bed, raising that bed higher and higher, until in many places the surface of the river sat above the level of the surrounding land, held in place by nothing but those aging walls of packed earth. Stop and picture that, because it is the single most important image for understanding why so many died. Across vast stretches of central China, millions of people were living and farming and raising children in towns that sat below the level of the river that ran past them. The water was over their heads before it ever broke free. Every levee was a held breath. And in the years leading up to 1931, while warlords and rival armies tore the country apart in the chaos that followed the collapse of imperial rule, the unglamorous, expensive, ceaseless work of dredging those channels and reinforcing those dikes had been neglected, defunded, and in many places simply abandoned. The men and the money that should have maintained the rivers were spent on civil war instead. Deforestation upstream had stripped the hillsides of the trees that once slowed the runoff, so the rain that fell reached the rivers faster and harder than it ever had. The country had quietly removed every safeguard at exactly the moment the weather decided to test all of them at once. And there is one more piece to the background, and it is the strangest one, and it will matter more than you would expect. In the city of Wuhan, the new nationalist government had been running an aggressive campaign against what it called superstition, sweeping away old temples and old beliefs in the name of a modern, scientific China. As part of that campaign, shortly before the flood arrived, officials demolished a temple in Wuhan dedicated to the Dragon King, the traditional deity who controlled rain and water. To the educated reformers running the city, this was progress. To enormous numbers of ordinary people, when the waters rose just weeks later and swallowed their city whole, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like the Dragon King taking his revenge. Hold on to that, because the way people interpreted this disaster, the stories they told themselves about why it was happening to them, would shape how they behaved when the water came, and in some cases it would get them killed. By June of 1931, the rivers were rising with a speed that frightened even people who had grown up watching them rise every year. Along stretches of the Yangtze, more than 600 millimeters of rain fell in June alone. People in the lowest-lying areas began abandoning their homes. The water crept up the trunks of trees and the walls of houses. And then, toward the end of July, after that monstrous month of 7 cyclones, the dikes began to fail. Not gracefully, not gradually, but in sudden catastrophic ruptures, each one releasing a wall of pent-up water onto fields where the crops had not even ripened and onto villages where families were sleeping. Then came the morning that broke Wuhan. Wuhan is really 3 old cities grown together at the confluence of the Yangtze and the Han River, and in 1931, it was one of the great industrial and commercial hubs of China, a place that prided itself on being modern. Refugees from the drowning countryside had already been streaming into the city since late spring, crowding onto whatever high ground they could find. And then, just before 6 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of July, a dike protecting the city gave way. The water came in fast. When it was done rising, an area of roughly 83 square kilometers was underwater, and something on the order of 782,000 people, city residents and rural refugees together, had been made homeless in a single stroke. The city center, the banks, the shops, the homes, all of it sat under many feet of water, and it did not drain away in a day or a week. Central Wuhan stayed flooded for close to 3 months. Picture what that actually means as a place to survive. The streets are now canals of filthy brown water. 30,000 people are crammed onto a single railway embankment in central Hankou, one of Wuhan's 3 cities, perched on the only strip of raised ground for miles, with the flood on both sides of them. People float through the submerged streets on doors and tables and crude rafts. And here is where you see something the older flood stories never had, because this was a thoroughly modern disaster striking a thoroughly modern city, and modernity had invented new ways to die. Barrels of benzene, an industrial chemical, broke loose from warehouses and went bobbing through the streets, banging into things, leaking. Kerosene caught fire on the surface of the water and set buildings burning even as they stood waist-deep in flood. Live electrical wiring, half submerged, turned the water itself into a weapon, and more than 50 people were electrocuted in the streets of their own drowned city. And the sewer system, the proud symbol of a clean and hygienic modern Wuhan, did the most quietly catastrophic thing of all. It reversed. Instead of carrying waste away from the city, it emptied the bowels of the city up into the standing water that hundreds of thousands of people were now wading through, drinking from, and living in. That detail is the hinge on which the entire death toll turns. So let me be very direct about why it matters to you, sitting wherever you are reading this. The thing about a flood is that the drowning is only the opening act. The drowning is fast and visible, and it kills a horrifying number of people in the first days. But the flood's real weapon, the one that does most of the killing, is what it does to the invisible systems that keep human beings alive between disasters. It poisons the water you drink. It destroys the food you were going to eat. It packs the survivors together in filth with no sanitation and no medicine. And then it waits. In some of the worst-hit areas of the 1931 flood, disease accounted for as much as 70% of all the deaths. Not the water, what the water left behind. And the diseases came in a procession, each one feeding on the bodies the last one had weakened. Cholera, the classic killer of the drowned and the displaced, broke out in the refugee camps of the Wuhan area toward the middle of September. At Hankou alone, the number of cholera cases among refugees was estimated at around 1,600, with a fatality rate that ran between 15 and 20% of everyone infected. And as the doctors tried to fight it, the town itself was still sitting under 4 feet of water, which made it impossible even to bury the dead. Let that image land. Cholera tearing through a packed refugee population, and nowhere dry to put the bodies. Alongside cholera came typhus and smallpox of a severe and aggressive type, reported across every province the flood had touched. Came dysentery, both amoebic and bacillary, endemic to the valley and now spreading like fire through the camps, killing infants in numbers the relief workers described as abnormally high. Came measles, came malaria, came schistosomiasis, the parasitic disease carried by the very snails that thrive in the kind of stagnant standing water the flood had created everywhere. The flood did not kill you once. It lined up half a dozen different ways to kill you and let them take turns. Now picture the people caught inside all of this, because the official reports and the death tolls have a way of sanding the human beings down into statistics, and the human beings are the whole point. A Catholic bishop named Edward Galvin, working with the Columban missionaries around Hanyang, one of Wuhan's 3 cities, sat down at the end of August and tried to describe what he was seeing. He wrote that there were already somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 refugees in the Wuhan area, and that soldiers had been posted along the banks of the Han River to physically stop any more from coming in, because the city could not hold them. Most of the refugees had climbed to whatever hills they could reach. On a single rise called Black Hill, in Hanyang, 60,000 people were crowded together. Months later, in November, Galvin walked through those hilltop camps and tried again to put words to it. He wrote that he simply could not describe the squalor and the sickness and the desolation. He described people quietly dying of starvation on every side, all of them undernourished, all of them dying from exposure, and around them malaria and dysentery and typhoid and cholera moving through the crowd, people dying so steadily and so quietly that death stopped being an event and became the weather. And the starvation he described was not incidental. It was structural, and it was permanent in a way the floodwater was not. The flood had not just drowned people. It had drowned the next year. Throughout the entire Yangtze Valley, roughly 15% of the wheat and rice crops were destroyed outright, and in the actual flood zone the proportion was vastly higher than that. In many places total, grain that had been stored against hard times floated away or rotted, and here is the cruelest mechanism of all. The water sat on the land for so long, in many places still standing when autumn came, that when the time arrived in the fall to plant the next season's crops, the fields were still underwater. The farmers could not plant, so even the survivors who lived through the drowning and dodged the cholera and the typhus now faced a guaranteed famine the following year, a famine baked into the calendar, because the ground that fed them would produce nothing. This is how a flood that crests in August keeps killing people the following summer. This is how you get a death toll that climbs for a year and a half, and it pushed human beings past the edge of what we like to believe people will do. The contemporary reports, the government records, the missionary letters, all of them describe the same unbearable things happening across the flood zone as the food ran out. Families ate tree bark and weeds. Desperate parents sold their daughters, and then their wives, simply to get money for food or to have one fewer mouth to feed. There were widespread reports of infanticide, of parents who could not feed a child making an unspeakable choice, and there were reports, credible and recurring across multiple regions, of cannibalism. This is what the deadliest flood in history actually looked like at ground level, not a dramatic wave. A slow, grinding erasure of every line a person believes they will never cross. But the water itself was still rising even as all of this unfolded, and it had not yet reached its worst. On the 19th of August, the flood hit its high water mark at Hankou, and the number recorded that day is almost hard to believe. The water did not arrive all at once at that peak. It climbed there, day after relentless day, through the first 3 weeks of August, a few inches at a time, so that people watched the marks they had scratched on walls and door frames vanish underwater one by one. Every morning, the survivors woke to find the line a little higher than the night before, the safe ground a little smaller, the islands of the living a little more crowded, until there was almost nowhere left to climb. By the 19th, the water level stood roughly 16 meters above the average, about 53 feet, more than 5 stories of water above where the river normally sat. That crest was about a meter and 3/4 higher than the level of the Bund in Shanghai, hundreds of miles downstream. The Yangtze had risen higher than any level ever previously recorded, 3 feet above the previous all-time peak, and it had done it while sprawling across an area that defies comprehension. How much area? The flood ultimately inundated something like 180,000 square kilometers. To make that mean something, picture the entirety of England plus half of Scotland underwater. Or picture the American states of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, all 3, submerged at once. 8 provinces bore the worst of it: Hubei, Hunan, Jiangsu, Anhui, Jiangxi, Zhejiang, Henan, and Shandong. But the flooding reached far beyond even that core zone, north into Manchuria, south as far as Guangdong and the Pearl River near Canton, west into Sichuan. The number of people whose lives were directly disrupted has been estimated at 25 million, and by some accounts as high as 52 million. To put that in perspective, the entire population of the United States at the time was around 123 million. This single flood, in a single summer, reached into the lives of a number of human beings approaching half the population of the United States, and it was inside that swollen, catastrophic August that the wall at Gyeyu broke and took 10 to 15,000 sleeping people, the scene we started with. By then it was just one breach among many. The Grand Canal, that ancient artery, was overwhelmed. The Yellow River, China's other monster, was flooding too. The waters of the Huai overflowed and went surging straight toward Nanjing, the national capital, a city that sat practically on an island, now ringed by floodwater like a medieval castle surrounded by its moat. The capital of the country was under siege by its own rivers. So what did the government do? This is where the flood stops being only a natural disaster and becomes a story about power and legitimacy, and how a catastrophe can quietly decide the fate of a nation. The nationalist government, the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, was young, shaky, and still trying to prove it actually controlled the country it claimed to rule. Through the previous decade of warlord chaos, the traditional functions of disaster relief had largely drifted into the hands of foreign and mixed Sino-foreign charitable organizations. For the nationalists, the 1931 flood was both an existential threat and an enormous opportunity. If they could mount a competent, modern, scientific relief effort, they could prove to their own people and to the world that there was finally a real government in China again. So they built one. They established the National Flood Relief Commission and put it under the authority of T.V. Soong, also known as Song Ziwen, one of the most powerful figures in the Kuomintang and the brother-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek himself. The commission gathered a genuinely impressive roster of talent, Chinese and foreign. There was Wu Lian, a world-famous epidemiologist who had earlier helped contain a massive plague outbreak in Manchuria. There was Liu Ruiheng, the health minister. There was John Grant, a pioneering public health expert. There was Oliver Todd, an American hydraulic engineer who knew Chinese rivers intimately. The League of Nations was brought in, and it sent a British refugee specialist named John Hope Simpson, a man who had cut his teeth managing the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, to handle the day-to-day operation of the relief. On paper, this was a serious, modern, capable response. And here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody expects, because one of the people who showed up to help fly over the flood and map its devastation was, of all people on Earth, Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man alive at that moment, the aviator who had stunned the world by flying solo across the Atlantic just 4 years earlier, happened to be making a survey flight across the top of the world from New York toward Tokyo, accompanied by his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who was herself a skilled pilot, navigator, and radio operator. Their route brought them to China in the middle of the catastrophe, and they immediately offered themselves and their aircraft to the relief effort. Their plane, a Lockheed Sirius, had a longer range than anything else available in China, which made it uniquely valuable for surveying an area this vast. They landed at Nanjing on a body of water called Lotus Lake on the 19th of September, and Anne later wrote that the floodwater stretched right up to the foot of the city wall, exactly like a moat around a medieval fortress. The Lindberghs went to work. Anne would fly the plane while Charles photographed and surveyed the devastation below, helping to map an additional 8,000 square miles of the disaster zone so that officials could actually plan where to send help. And it was from up there, looking down, that Anne Morrow Lindbergh grasped a truth that the cheerful organizational charts in Nanjing had concealed. She wrote later about looking down on the flooded villages, on the people stranded on tiny islands, on what she described as countless human beings like gnats on the surface of the water, and feeling the hopelessness of it settle over her. How, she wondered, could relief ever reach these people? The water was not deep enough for large boats. There were no roads, and in many places there never had been. There were no central points to distribute food from, just thousands of tiny isolated villages, or what was left of them, scattered across an area larger than the state of Massachusetts. She had identified from the cockpit of an airplane the exact reason the relief effort was doomed to fall short. You cannot save people you physically cannot reach. Charles tried anyway. With his plane's cramped space, he made an attempt to deliver aid directly, flying 2 doctors and some medical supplies to the struggling, cut-off city of Hinghua, the place known today as Pushin. When he came down onto the water there, desperate sampans, the small wooden boats of the river people, swarmed the aircraft from every direction, so many of them and so frantic that they nearly capsized it. The arrival of help was itself almost a catastrophe, because the need was so far beyond anything the help could match. Eventually, the Lindberghs' famous plane was damaged on the Yangtze, banged up badly enough that the most celebrated aviator of his generation had to leave China, not by air but by boat, an ending so anticlimactic that people back home found it almost unbelievable. The relief effort, for all its talent and its famous volunteers, was fighting a losing battle, and the reasons it was losing are where the disaster reaches out and grabs the rest of the 20th century by the throat. The first problem was the one Anne Lindbergh had seen from the air. The flood had destroyed the roads and the boats and the communication lines, the very infrastructure you would need to move food and medicine to the dying. Where relief workers did manage to move supplies, they often had to carry them through territory torn by the ongoing civil war, areas full of bandits and communist forces who would seize the relief shipments for themselves, and sometimes kidnap the relief workers outright. And the international medical aid that the League of Nations had called for, when nations were urged in September to send money and doctors and supplies out of sympathy and out of fear that epidemics in China could spread to the world, mostly arrived about 2 months after the appeal went out, by which point cholera and typhus had already done much of their work. But the single thing that crippled the relief effort most was a date, the 18th of September, 1931. On that day, while central China was still drowning, While hundreds of thousands of refugees were dying on hilltops, the Imperial Japanese Army staged an incident in Manchuria and launched a full invasion of China's northeast. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. The nationalist government had been planning to fund a huge portion of its flood relief by issuing bonds. The Japanese invasion sent a shock through China's financial markets, and the bond market collapsed. The money the government had been counting on to save the flood victims evaporated overnight, swallowed by the opening move of what would become the long, grinding war between China and Japan. The government eventually managed to secure a large loan of wheat and flour from the United States, but even that was hard to use, because the Japanese now controlled approaches that made it difficult to import the grain through Shanghai. A single disaster had collided with the start of a world war, and the people on the hilltops paid for the collision with their lives. And yet, inside that failure, there were people doing extraordinary things, and the way they did them tells you something about how a modern state even attempts to fight a catastrophe this large. The Relief Commission did not simply hand out bowls of rice, partly because there was nowhere near enough rice, and partly because the planners had a colder, smarter idea. They built a work relief system. Instead of feeding idle refugees who would only drift and sicken, they paid them, in food and in wages, to rebuild the very dikes that had drowned them. Hundreds of thousands of refugees became a labor army, hauling earth in baskets on their shoulders, packing it into the broken walls, raising the embankments back up by hand. In the first half of 1932 alone, this human machine reconstructed something on the order of 2,000 kilometers of dikes, an almost incomprehensible volume of earth moved without a single bulldozer. It was brilliant and it was brutal at the same time, because the people rebuilding the walls were starving and sick even as they worked, and the work itself was a wager. Rebuild your own prison wall faster than the next flood can arrive, or drown again. The medical side was its own quiet war, and at the center of it stood Wu Lian, the epidemiologist who had already once saved untold lives by stopping a plague in Manchuria. He understood that the refugee camps, packed and filthy and waterlogged, were perfect breeding grounds for the cholera that would soon arrive, and he launched mass inoculation campaigns through the camps, trying to put a needle into as many arms as possible before the disease reached them. Imagine the scene: long lines of exhausted, half-starved refugees on a muddy hillside, being inoculated against a disease that was already in the water at their feet, by doctors who knew they could not possibly reach everyone in time. Every person they vaccinated was a coin flip won against death, and there were never enough doctors, never enough vaccine, never enough dry ground. Some communities had no high ground to flee to at all, because their whole world had always been the water. The Tanka people, the boat dwellers who for generations had lived their entire lives on sampans along the Yangtze, born on the water and married on the water and buried from the water, were among the hardest hit of anyone. When the river that was their home turned violent, they had no land to retreat to and no farm to lose because they had never had one. The flood did not just damage them. It came for the one element they had built their entire existence around, and it took it. But it gets stranger, and in a way more human, because even in the middle of all this dying, the disaster reached out and pulled in the wider world in ways nobody could have scripted. Charity poured into China from across the planet. Overseas Chinese communities scattered through Southeast Asia gave with a generosity that stunned the relief workers, sending money back to a homeland many of them had not seen in years to save people they would never meet. And in the United States, A then little-known American writer who had grown up in China sat down and began writing short stories about the flood specifically to inspire donations. Stories that were read aloud on American radio to move listeners to give. Her name was Pearl Buck, and within a few short years she would win the Nobel Prize in Literature. The deadliest flood in history quietly helped pull one of the great literary voices of the century toward the subject of China, the subject that would define her life's work. Inside China itself, the flood seared its way into the culture and never fully left. The acclaimed left-wing novelist Ding Ling wrote a short story about it, simply titled Water, that became one of the most famous Chinese literary responses to the disaster. A motion picture called Raging Torrent was filmed in the aftermath, telling fictional stories set during the flood in Hubei. The film itself is lost now, every print gone, but the script survives, a ghost of a movie about a disaster that was itself trying to erase the record of its own dead. Artists understood something the bureaucrats could not put in a report: that a catastrophe this size is not only a number, it is a wound in the memory of a people, and someone has to keep speaking it or it disappears. Now I want to be honest with you about the numbers, because the honesty is part of the horror. The official report of the National Flood Relief Commission stated that around 140,000 people had drowned, and then added a line that says more than any statistic could. It said that an additional number of people, a number which could not be accurately ascertained, but which must be very large, had been killed by other causes directly connected to the flood, mainly starvation and disease. The government's own relief workers, the people standing in the middle of it with the best data anyone had, privately estimated the real total at around 2 million dead. A field survey led by the agricultural economist John Lossing Buck out of the University of Nanking found that 150,000 had drowned in just the first 100 days, and that this drowning represented less than a quarter of all the deaths in that period. Edmund Clubb, an American diplomat who lived through the flood at the consulate in Hankou, put the figure at around 2 million as well. Some Western sources pushed it to 3.7 or even 4 million. Decades later, a team of Chinese historians led by Lai Wenhai, working carefully through contemporary records, arrived at a figure of around 422,000. So why can't we know? Why is the gap between the low estimate and the high estimate larger than the entire death toll of most famous disasters? Because the flood destroyed the very thing you would need to count the dead. It drowned the local government offices and their records. It scattered and killed the officials who kept the registers. It even inundated the printing presses, so that for much of the disaster, the only reports getting out were written by journalists outside the flood zone, or by refugees like Zai Qianmao, a writer whose own city of Wuhan was drowned and who fled, and then wrote a long, anguished account he called the Great Hankou Flood. When a disaster is so total that it destroys society's ability to even record its own losses, the true scale of those losses becomes literally unknowable. We will never have the real number. The people who could have given it to us are part of it. And this is the point in the story where you might expect things to wind down, where the water recedes and the country rebuilds and the lesson is learned. That is not what happened. What happened is that this flood quietly helped break a government and remake a nation of 500 million people, and the consequences of that are still shaping the world you live in. Think about what the disaster did to the legitimacy of the nationalist government. They had seized on the flood as their chance to prove they were a modern, capable state that could protect its people, and by the measure of their own ambitions, they had failed, visibly, catastrophically, in front of the entire country and the world. They had failed to maintain the rivers in the years before. They had failed to fund the relief when the bond market collapsed. They had been unable to reach the dying, unable to stop the epidemics, unable to feed the starving. Reports from foreign diplomats documented relief funds being embezzled by local officials, supplies being siphoned off before they ever reached the people they were meant for, aid disproportionately benefiting urban elites and the military, while the rural peasants in the hardest-hit inland provinces, the great majority of the victims, were left to die. Every one of those failures became a story that ordinary Chinese people told about who their government really served. And remember that demolished Dragon King Temple in Wuhan. When the flood came, that rumor metastasized. Many people became convinced the disaster was supernatural punishment, that the city of Hankou was simply doomed. A contemporary report described thousands of people so convinced their city was finished that they refused to help themselves or be helped, sitting and waiting stoically for death. So total was the discontent that prominent officials, including the mayor of Wuhan, Hebei Ahua, and the local garrison commander, Xia Daoyan, ended up performing ritual ceremonies and kowtowing to the very Dragon King their government had insulted, trying to calm a population that had lost faith in everything official. Now connect the dots. There was, at this moment in Chinese history, a rival political movement that had been telling people exactly this story all along, that the government was corrupt, that it served the rich and abandoned the poor, that it was incapable of protecting ordinary people. That movement was the Communist Party. The 1931 flood, and the floods and famines and failures that kept recurring in the years that followed, became living proof of the communist argument, evidence you could see from your own drowned doorstep. The disaster did not single-handedly cause the Chinese Revolution, but it poured itself into the case the communists were building, the case that the old order had failed and had to be swept away. 18 years later, in 1949, the Communist Party won the Civil War and transformed China into the nation it remains today. You cannot fully understand how that happened without understanding the decade of catastrophe that came before it. And the 1931 flood stands at the head of that decade like a gravestone. And the rivers themselves became an obsession that has lasted to this day. The flood made it impossible to ignore the truth that China's prosperity and China's destruction came from the same source, water that had to be controlled, or it would kill you by the million. In the immediate aftermath, the government set up the Huai River Conservancy Commission, and within the first half of 1932, working at desperate speed, laborers reconstructed something like 2,000 kilometers of dikes, moving an almost unimaginable volume of earth by hand in just 6 months. The American engineer Oliver Todd led field studies in 1935 and 1936 to design dams and diversion channels meant to keep a 1931 scale flood from ever happening again. But the chaos of the war with Japan and the Civil War that followed meant most of these grand plans went unbuilt or were built only in small fragments. The dream stayed a dream, but it never died. The 1931 flood and the equally deadly floods that struck the Yangtze again in 1954 and 1998 kept alive a single enormous idea, that China should build a dam across the Yangtze so vast it could swallow the river's fury before it reached the lowlands where the people lived. In 1953, just a few years after taking power, Mao Zedong traveled to the regions along the Yangtze to promote exactly this idea, the dream of a colossal flood control project on the river. It took another half a century, but that dream became the Three Gorges Dam, the largest power station on Earth, finally completed in 2012. And when engineers and officials explained why a project of such staggering cost and such enormous human displacement was necessary, why entire cities had to be relocated, and 1 million people moved. They pointed back across 80 years to 1931. They pointed to the flood that killed millions in weeks to explain why the river could never again be allowed to run free. So here is why this matters to you, specifically, no matter where you live. The 1931 flood is the clearest case study we have of a truth that the modern world keeps relearning the hard way. A natural disaster is never purely natural. The rain came from the sky, yes. But the reason the rain killed millions instead of thousands was a chain of human choices made over decades and centuries. The walling in of rivers, the draining of the lakes that used to absorb the floods, the stripping of the forests, the diversion of money from maintenance to war, the corruption that hollowed out the response. The disaster was the rain falling onto all of those decisions at once. The vulnerability was built long before the trigger was pulled. And that lesson is not historical trivia. The lower reaches of the Yangtze, the exact landscape that drowned in 1931, today hold around half of China's population and a huge share of its economy, all of it living behind walls, much of it below the level of the water. Those walls hold back. The same is true of river deltas and coastal plains all over the world, including some of the most crowded and valuable real estate on the planet. We have not stopped building our cities below the waterline. We have built more of them and put more people in them. And as the climate shifts and the storms that once came twice a year arrive 7 times in a month, we are running the 1931 experiment again on a global scale, and mostly hoping the walls hold. The flood that killed millions in weeks did not give the world a tidy ending. The water at Gyeongju went still. The survivors on Black Hill eventually came down. The dikes were patched. The river went back into its raised and dangerous bed. And then the famine of the following year killed more, and the war with Japan killed vastly more, and the Civil War after that, and the disaster faded out of the world's memory as if a catastrophe that large could simply be misplaced. But the people who study these things have never forgotten it, and neither should you, because somewhere right now there is a river running above the heads of a sleeping city, held back by a wall, and there is rain in the forecast. The number on the death toll from 1931 is a question we can never answer. The number on the next one is a question we are still, foolishly, choosing to leave open.